Good morning and welcome to UUKI and NOUS's joint webinar on Australian higher education and its response to Covid-19. Good morning to those people who are joining us in the UK, and to my panelists from Australia, thank you very much for staying up a bit late to take part in this discussion. Anybody who's involved in UK higher education policy and politics knows that the UK and Australia keep a very close eye on each other. Generally speaking, my impression is that in the UK we feel that the Australian sector is sometimes a little bit ahead of us in terms of responding to new pressures and effectively lobbying its government to support. I don't know whether the same impression is shared by Australian colleagues, but we certainly took some satisfaction from the announcement of our graduate route in the way that that's galvanised the Australian sector into stepping up again on international recruitment. But the bottom line is, we are systems which are so similar that even under normal circumstances, there's a lot to learn from hearing reciprocally from each other's university leaders. Now, especially, that's the case. COVID-19, it hit the Australian sector earlier than the UK sector because of the academic cycles. And our sense in the UK anyway is that the Australian sector has responded very effectively to the challenges that it created. So we wanted to create an opportunity with Nous Group to hear a little bit from two university leaders in Australia. One who's very well known to us, having previously been the Vice-chancellor of a UK university, Paul Wellings, a very good friend to many of us in the UK, and one who's about to become a very central player in our system, Michael Spence, who will be shortly joining UCL as its Vice-chancellor in January, coming from the University of Sydney. And into the mix, we're putting Libby Hackett, somebody who knows more about the UK higher education policy landscape than almost anybody I know, but now as a principal of Nous Group and having spent some time working in the Australian higher education sector, very well placed to give an insight into how both systems are adapting. We're going to do the following. We're going to hear from each of the panelists just to open up the discussion about how their individual universities or how the sector as a whole has responded to COVID-19. I'm going to then start to delve into some of the issues that I think will be of greatest interest from the UK side, and we're going to open it up then to questions. You should see that there's a chat function in this platform. We'd like you to feel free, please do ask questions using the chat function, and I'll try and get as many of those questions to panelists over the course of the next hour. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn over first to Libby Hackett, who is a principal with Nous Group, to kick us off. Libby, thank you very much.
Thank you, Viv, and delighted to be with you here today. Thank you. So I'm going to undertake a quick oversight of the Australian higher ed system for those who are less familiar with it, and to help with the comparison with the UK. Hopefully this will allow you to see how the impact of COVID is starting to be felt in the two different countries. So just going to move on to the first slide. Bear with me. Okay, so there are 41 universities in Australia, 39 of them public universities. This compares to about 130 universities in the UK. In Australia, there are about 1.5 million students, and this compares to about 2.4 million in the UK. Now, bear in mind that Australia has about a third of the UK population. We have about a half of your GDP, however, and that is due to a larger commodities export market. But let's think about the scale of the sector. We have a similar number of universities per head of population, but Australia has more students per capita, and therefore our universities tend to be larger. So we have 36,000 students per university on average, compared to 18,000 in the UK. Indeed, we have 8 universities with over 50,000 students and some with over 70,000 students. If I move on to student number controls, just as in the UK, we tend to go back and forth with student number controls. At the moment, we are a demand-driven system in theory, but funded places are controlled, and therefore we're acting and operating much more like a capped or controlled system at the moment. This could change following COVID-19 and because of population increases coming through, but that's a really interesting reversal of the current situation in the UK with number caps. In terms of rankings and quality of university, Australia has 6 universities in the top 100 rankings in QS. That's around 15% of our universities. This compares in very similar way to the UK, which has 18 universities in the top 100, which is around 14–15% of your system as well. In terms of international students, we have 480,000 international students in Australia, which is about a third of all of our student population. In the UK, you have slightly fewer. You have 460,000 international students. And of course, this is within a larger system as well. So you have around 20% of your student population being international students. In Australia, international education is now the 4th largest export market and our largest service export as well. It's a huge success story, just as it is in the UK. 2 interesting contrasts to bring to your attention. If you look at the top right of the slide, you'll see that Australian universities are largely non-residential. These are commuting student populations predominantly. Largely students will study in-state and within the city in which they live. The second is that the academic year, of course, runs more like the calendar year. So Australian universities will start in late February and finish up in early December. The ban on flights from China in Australia was first introduced on the 1st of February, and this left 100,000 students outside of Australia in semester 1. But over the semester, we've now reached a point where 80% of our international students, it is thought, are in country, if not on campus, for semester 1. Now, this is really interesting. If you take that along with the idea of potentially secure corridors opening up for Australia from January 2021, which we can come back and talk about, this is a potential point of contrast, again, with the UK, with our students being able to be in country at least and have access to being in the country. So a system comparison, if you go to the bottom of the slide in blue, you'll see that these systems are very similar, and this is something Viv was referring to. So the Australian federal government funds universities for domestic students and for research, very similar to the UK. So for students, it's a combination of Commonwealth grant or T funding in old English language and student loans. The balance is a bit different for us. We have lower levels of student fee contribution, but the system is basically the same. And for research funding, it is also a dual funding model, just as with the UK. We have lower QR levels by comparison and more emphasis on competitive grants through research councils. Overall, the Australian government funds around 55% of the total university revenue in Australia, which means that around 45% comes from non-government sources, which takes me to the next slide. And this is my final slide, and I won't run through it in detail, but you can have a look at those stats yourself. Generally speaking, what I wanted to flag is that Australian universities receive lower levels of government funding for research compared to the UK. They receive lower levels of government funding for domestic students compared to the UK. We're nearer a sort of 6K average in pounds as opposed to a 9K fee, and we don't have additional funding for high cost subjects either, so think about that. And thirdly, there's no industry engagement funding equivalent, so no high funding equivalent. What that means is that we are more dependent on international student funding compared to the UK. Now, before you start to feel sorry for Australian universities, don't. Their total spend on research, for example, is very similar to the UK. So we spend around 0.7% of GDP on research, which is almost identical to the UK. And you can see that in our ranking, and our performance is very, very similar to UK university sector. But what we do have, of course, is that higher level of cross-subsidy of income from international student revenue. We'll unpack that further throughout this discussion, I'm sure, but the obvious implication is in terms of exposure to the international market and the impact that that might have in terms of research capability in Australia. And finally, just to look at the financial implication of COVID-19 across the whole system, it's estimated that there's been around $3 to $4.5 billion loss of revenue thanks to COVID-19, which is around £1.5 to £2.5 billion. That puts around 21,000 jobs at risk, is the estimate, and around 7,000 of those are expected to be in research-related roles. But that is all up for grabs in terms of response and managing this process. I'll stop there. There's a full slide deck which has been prepared, which will be circulated afterwards. It includes more specific information about impacts and responses. There's a really interesting contrast in Australia between the federal and state government responses, with parallels to the UK, which I'd like to come back to, but I'm sure that that will be something that we'll touch on in Q&A. So I'll stop there and hand over either back to Viv or to Michael. Thank you.
Okay, Libby, thank you very much. There are a couple of points in what you have said that I do think we should come back to. The federal versus state has some parallels with our devolved systems. And the other thing I'd like to come back to is that question of over-reliance, potential charges that the Australian sector has been over-reliance on international fee income. A similar debate, I think, is starting to happen in the UK. Thank you very much indeed for that. I'm now going to turn to Professor Paul Wellings, who's Vice-chancellor of the University of Wollongong. He was previously Vice-chancellor of the University of Lancaster in the UK, and has been very involved in UK higher education politics for a very long time. Paul, I'm going to pass over to you, but I wonder if in your remarks you could find a way of sneaking in and answer the question, are you happy to be in Australia, or would you rather be in the UK right now? Paul, over to you.
Thanks. Well, I think it's a choice of the frying pan or the fire on that last question, because the systems are so similar, and as Libby's just said, the consequences and how this plays out, I suspect, will be very, very similar. So I think what I'm going to do is just to give a very brief overview of how this has played out at the University of Wollongong, and I suspect Michael will have perspectives from Sydney. Here, we are, by UK standards, a large university, just over 30,000. Most probably have 13,000 commencers each year and about 23,000 continuers. And that's a mixture of international, domestic, and international onshore. About 8,000 students come to Wollongong. We have a very large international offshore activity as well, and I'm not going to touch on that aspect in tonight's presentation. What we did very early on was form a view that COVID-19 was going to be rather serious, and by January we'd stood up our crisis management process. So that was an immediate thing we'd done. 2 weeks later, we established a financial control group, which is essentially the Senior Deputy Vice-Chancellor and the Chief Operating Officer, and their role is to say no. And so they've been cast in that mode ever since. We could see the impact of COVID coming quite quickly, as could every other university. And the really big thing that Australian universities did was to pivot to remote learning. Here at Wollongong, we made the decision to change the starting point of our sessions and actually delayed by 2 weeks. And if I look back at the really good things we've done, that one intervention to put a space bar in and have a 2-week break was really critical, because that allowed us to do train the trainer. We most probably had several thousand hours of training for staff, and we've gone remote with 1,000 subjects, which is a huge achievement for us, given that we were not a remote institution. We were pretty much a campus-based, face-to-face institution. And the stunning feature of that is that the student satisfaction in those data now coming back in is very high. So students are not happy not to be on campus, but they can see that universities and collectively have made a huge effort to keep continuity, and I think that's a major learning. I think the other thing I want to jump to is some consequences for the student body, and we can see quite large pockets of hardship and deprivation, both in international students, but also in Australian domestic students. A lot of Australian domestic students, like the international students, have part-time jobs and work in the gig economy, and many of those jobs have evaporated. Here at Wollongong, we've allocated $5 million 2020 and $5 million in 2021 as a hardship fund. New South Wales collectively, the universities, I think, have released about $170 million over the triennium, and somewhat slowly, if I can put it like that, the state government of New South Wales has released $20 million towards hardship. And roughly the break between international claims and domestic claims is 2 to 1. So we can see that a lot of students who've come into our system from international locations had come in on the assumption of holding part-time jobs. All of those jobs have gone. So that's the second thing I want to touch on. So the third thing is around the consequence for the university's budget. And this is obviously material because with so many international onshore students, as Libby indicated, many of those students got held back because they couldn't travel into Australia. Our income for 2020 is down 13%, 1-3. And so that's caused us for the 2020 academic year to have a $90 million hole on a $690 million turnover roughly. And that's a material consequence for us. What we're very worried about is 2021 because of the pipeline effect of students, and we're also concerned that 2022 will be soft in terms of recovery of international students coming back to Wollongong. So we're now modelling the consequences of that, and because 55% of our expenditure is staff, we're now in discussions with our staff around whether the options to reduce benefits for a period of time, and we've put 2 options today to staff, actually, an 18-month lag in benefits or a 12-month lag in benefits. So this is a mixture of pay cuts, reduction in future pay rises, compulsory leave, and fractionalisation, so 9-day fortnights. That would return some sum of money to the university. We'll go to a poll, and then if staff want to pick up one of those options, we'll go formally through the Fair Work Commission processes as we're required to do. Many universities are looking at that. My instinct is that even with all of that, the minimum number of job losses at Wollongong will be about 150. So these are really material, and there's no way around that. As Libby indicated, there are thousands of jobs at stake here, and that would be true, I suspect, in the UK as well as here. The last thing is around the return to international. I'm currently the chair of the New South Wales Vice-chancellors committee, and we've done a lot of work there with New South Wales Treasury and other officials trying to build a pathway for international students. And on current frameworks, that would require international students to go through the normal processes of visa acquisition, English language testing, getting on a plane, and then coming to a 2-week quarantine period, most probably in hotels in Sydney, and then dispersing to universities beyond that. It is controversial because all of those quarantine processes to date have been used for returning internationals who've been away, Australians who've been away on international experiences. And so this would be a flip to use those assets in a different way. The really big problem is that once students get off the plane in Australia, the health, the quarantine, and the post-quarantine issues will all become policy debates that require unpacking. We think the cost per student is about $5,000 per student to add these additional costs. So the debate then will be, where do those resources come from, and is that, if I can put it crudely, the yield from each university that gets clipped, or is it a co-share between government, the student, and the university? The final thing I'd say is there are enormous knock-on effects here that we don't really understand. Internally, as Libby indicated, there's cross-subsidisation to research, and the research fabric for the major research-led universities could come unstuck very quickly here if we don't get better support from government. And the other thing that we don't understand is the connection to other industries. So roughly 40% of New South Wales's tourism dollar comes from the families and supporters of international students who come to visit their children, stay longer, have deeper experiences and travel around the state. And so the connectivity between the way that higher education has been set up here and a whole range of service industries, whether it be health insurance, banking, tourism, etc., all of those things are interconnected. And the revelation for me is that our state governments and our federal governments don't understand the complexity of the system that's been created. I'll stop there because I suspect there'll be other areas to explore, and I know Michael will want to come in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. One topic I think we should perhaps come back to is this question about the government response to the consequences for research. I think this is also a very sort of live debate in the UK. Michael, you're about to join us in the UK as one of the Vice-chancellor of one of our most prestigious institutions. In your remarks, wonder if you would also reflect on the question, are you glad you're coming or do you wish you were staying put? Over to you, Michael.
So very glad I'm coming. I know the UK system well. I was at Oxford for 20 years and I'm very glad to be coming back, although I love Sydney and have spent over a third of my life in one way or another at the university. So the university is slightly different to Wollongong. We're much larger, so we have about 73,000 students. We are incredibly comprehensive. We once did a comparison with the top 200 universities, and we teach more subjects than any other university in the top 200. About 44% of our students in any given year, between 44 and 46% of our students are international students. They come from 140 countries, but just over half of them come from the PRC, which is not surprising given that the PRC sends 3 times more students overseas than anybody else, and our geography and all the rest of it. So we've had COVID-19 in 3 phases. We first had a phase where our Chinese students were unable to come, and that was obviously going to be a very significant issue because the Australian government introduced travel bans to China. And of course, it was not only a big issue for us, but also potentially a big issue for the local economy, because in 2019, we were responsible for about $5.9 billion of economic value to the national economy, and responsible for creating about 36,000 jobs outside the university in the kinds of fields that Paul's talked about, but also construction and all the rest of it. So very quickly, within about 2 weeks, we had 1,000 units of study online and had set up very strong links with as many of our Chinese students as we were able to retain. And it was a communications campaign, it was a support campaign to make sure that those links were still strong. And I have this party trick of giving speeches in Chinese, so I would send cheery weekly videos to our students in Chinese and all the rest of it, and that was very much the focus. And then of course it hit in Australia, and it was relatively easy to put our teaching online, and because we'd done so much work for the Chinese market, and as Paul said, the response from students has been extremely positive, and that's been terrific. And the crisis management literature sort of makes this suggests that this is not atypical. That was, if anything, exciting for the institution. It was galvanizing. Leaders were at their best. We cut through red tape, things happened, staff were engaged. It was a terrific time to be alive, as it were. And then it all sort of happens. And the crisis management literature often talks about a regression phase, when life just becomes rather more difficult, everybody is a bit more tired, things are a bit more tetchy. And for us, that's hit in a number of ways. The first is that although our revenue has been significantly impacted, so we've lost about $470 million out of our $2.8 billion budget revenue. Although our revenue has been significantly impacted, the work to be done has not been reduced. So we're not an airline that stopped flying or whatever. Most of our students, about 86% of our students, are still on campus. It's just the ones that pay the most are not on campus. And so if you have 86 of 100 people in your class and they're more anxious because they're sitting at home on Zoom and they need to telephone, they need to email you all the time to make sure, there's lots of work to be done across the institution, but there's less revenue to support it. And obviously we've done the kinds of things that you might expect in hiring freezes and deferring capital programs and all of those sorts of things. And now we're in the process, and COVID-19 has been unusual in Australia in that it's been particularly well managed, very high levels of testing, very strong social control. And so, I think last night there were 8,000, or there's about 8,000 or 9,000 tests a day, and there were 8 new cases. And it's, it's a great crisis if there's a 20 case day. And so we're now in the position, and have been for a little while, of planning the return to campus. And the return to campus is much more tricky because we've got to keep our online business for the students who are still stuck overseas and teach many of the same things now in some way that satisfies a community expectation that is face-to-face, but in a context where social distancing requirements mean that every person on campus has to have 4 square meters of their own space, and therefore where we're only able to have about half the people on campus at any given point. And of course with staff too, you're working as it were against their anxieties, talking to people about coming back out of what is now for many people actually quite a comfortable regime of working at home. And I think managing the return to campus is, for universities both here in the UK, going to be much more complex than managing the than managing the exit. And I think it'd be really interesting during the questions to hear people's experience about how that's happening in the UK. One thing that didn't happen here, and where we have some advantage over the UK, is that we were never required to stop activity altogether. So all the way through, many research laboratories remained open, the campus remained open for students who needed study spaces, and therefore, while we're organising a return to campus, it's not a return to campus from a dead stop in the kind of way that it has been in most UK institutions. That complex picture of the current phase, the phase in which the detailed planning is being done about how many students you can have in a room, and therefore what classes should be online and what classes should be face-to-face, and the decisions about the priority of the kind of experiences that you're offering students face-to-face as opposed to online, and all the rest of it. That's also met, I think, fear in staff across the sector about the security of their jobs for the kinds of reasons that Paul was talking about. And in Sydney, because we are a relatively wealthy institution, that's taken the form of staff essentially saying, look, there is no real financial problem here, there's nothing to see. And indeed, not only should we be making sure that we're not losing any permanent jobs, but we should be paying casuals for teaching that they might have expected to have, even though we don't have the students to give them the teaching to teach. And so it's a very different kind of conversation in Sydney to the conversation that's going on in some other parts of the sector in Australia. And that's partly also because we have a proud history of very radical trade unionism at the university. The long and the short of it is, we will protect our staff complement, and we'll do it because we're pretty convinced that the Australian international education offer is incredibly attractive. We're a COVID-safe environment, and I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to say that when I arrive in January in UCL, but we are a COVID-safe environment in a similar time zone to our home markets, so you can ring your mum and dad in your daytime, offering a high quality English language education. So Australian international education will remain very attractive, and we're doing what we can to preserve our staff complement for the first semester next year. That said, if the international student market falls apart in the way that some people have suggested, it really is all over Red Rover. So in 1990, the University of Sydney got 90% of its funding from government sources. We now get 30% of our funding from government sources. And the international student income is a very significant part of that. And that also leads to complexities in leading the institution at the moment in people's capacity to think around different horizons. So there's a whole set of planning and talking that we're doing, and of course this is going on in every university everywhere, but around exactly how we manage next week and the week after, and particularly second semester this year. There's a whole set of conversations that we are having about how we recover from this financially over the next couple of years. But then there's also a conversation that we're having, set of conversations that we're having about what the post-COVID university looks like, either in the context in which the international student business recovers, or in the context in which the international student business doesn't recover. And different constituencies in the university, it's not like a normal university strategic planning process where you go out and you paint a vision and you talk to everybody and you consult with staff and students, alumni and stakeholders, and industry groups, and government and all the rest of it, and you come up with a plan. Our governing body is, of course, very interested in the long term, and most of our staff are worried about how they're going to get exams done in a couple of weeks. And the finance community is thinking about how it's going to manage the next couple of years, even if it turns out to be okay. And so different communities of the university have their focus in different places. And yet those conversations have to be brought together in ways that make sure that decisions we take in the short term don't foreclose options for the future, or that the decisions that are made, or that directions that are taken for the long term, aren't actually decisions that we're making in a hasty environment now with incomplete information about things like the recovery of the international student market, or for that matter, whether or not 1921 is going to come and this whole thing will be over like the Spanish flu and we'll all go back to business as usual, or whether or not there is some so-called new normal in which social distancing is going to be a part of our lives for at least 5 or 10 years. And so I think the real trick for university leaders at the moment is getting those conversations that are working like Russian dolls around different time horizons, working in ways in which they are coordinated and in which nobody feels left out, and yet in which decisions are being made in a coherent way. So our experience has been, beginning was great and was really the university at its best. Now everybody's a whole lot more tired and it's a lot more messy, but we're pretty confident for particularly the first semester next year.
Thank you so much indeed. You know, as you were talking, the question that was pottering through my mind is, what on earth are you going to make of the challenge that you'll face in the UK? You're dealing not only with the kind of pressures that you've talked in terms of COVID-19 about sort of staff relations, but we've got the pensions debate also playing into that. And of course, we have, in fact, left the European Union. We're not entirely sure where we're headed, but, you know, that is happening. It's all a bit of a pickle. Right, there are so many things that
it's a great opportunity. The UK higher education system is a great jewel in the crown of what the UK has to offer the world. And it's a time for UK universities to really be stepping up and participating in the public conversation and setting a bit of direction.
Yeah, well, that is a great segue to the question that I was going to ask first, which is, when you arrive, one of the first things that will happen to you is you'll get a meeting with our Secretary of State. What is it that you're going to be telling him about the way the UK government should respond, having learnt from the experience of the way that either the Australian government has got it right or things the Australian government should have done?
I think continuing the UK government's commitment to research is incredibly important. So it will worry me at UCL how you find the extra 22 pence of the 88 pence in the pound. In Australia, I have to find $1.75 for every dollar of a research grant I get. And it's important not to over-subsidize your research ecosystem from the international student market. And it's very tempting. You know, there are not many votes in research. As Paul was suggesting, it's only recently that Australian governments have come to recognise the economic value of what we do, even though they would glibly say that we were, until recently, the third largest export industry. Gas has had a bit of a run. But I really would encourage the UK government to continue its strong investment in research and to keep the promises that it made about European Union matching European Union research funding, even in a difficult economic context.
Great, I suspect we're going to continue talking about that. Fantastic. We are starting to get questions from the audience. We've got over 100 people watching us at the moment, which is lovely. If you are watching, don't be shy. Please do give us questions. The intention is to create an opportunity for you to interrogate Australian university leaders on the things that you're struggling with back home. There are a number of those topics I know I want to come back to. We certainly, I think, want to talk about that return to campus, that very, very difficult, complex business that you're trying to work out at the moment, and so are we. And I think I would like to come back to the sort of nitty-gritty of the cost cutting and how you achieve the short-term financial objectives without damaging the institution in the long term. I think a point, Michael, you were touching on. But before we start with that, I'm going to start with a question. One of the reasons we wanted to do this with Nous is that we think that there is such an important role for the strategic leadership of universities right now. The judgments you have to make under pressure in a crisis will have extraordinarily significant long-term consequences for the health of institutions. Looking back at the experience of the last few months, what did you get right? What do you wish you had done differently? And what will change in the way you make decisions from this point on? Is there anything that you have done during this crisis that you want to preserve as a sort of business as usual strategic leadership approach? Paul, can I start with you?
Yeah, I think I sort of signaled a little bit around the move to remote learning, which is something that every university did. And, you know, here at Wollongong, our strategic plan has a section around, you know, a shift to digitalization comprehensively. And that was a 3-year sort of journey for us. We most probably on the learning and teaching side have done in 3 months what we were setting out to do in 3 years. So the speed of action of staff, their energy, enthusiasm, their understanding of the pressure was very high. And as I said earlier, I think the space bar that we put in, which was only 2 weeks, and the speed at which we were able to take our learning and teaching curriculum development people and to do the train the trainer has made an enormous difference in capacity to staff. And so as we come back, I think the thing that we now have to capture are the high points of what we've got. We know that here at Wollongong, we have a lot of students who study engineering, IT, science, nursing, medicine. So we haven't been able to do the practical classes for those students, and we need to bring them back. But at the same time, we need, I think, to go through a process that says, what have we learnt from moving students into the online environment? And I think there are a couple of points there. One is students want to be on campus. A very substantial part of the learning is student to student and student to staff member in discussion. It's not sitting in bedroom number 2 or 3 in your house with a computer talking on Zoom. It's a much more intimate relationship. But I think we do need to say, are there any efficiencies that have come out of being in the online world that we should try and capture in perpetuity for certain categories of activity? And I think that's something that we need to do. I think the other learning that's sort of unfinished in Australia is the intersection with the professional accreditation bodies. There are a lot of students who have degrees which have oversight through psychology or engineering or medicine, whatever it might be, with a professional body. And I think, without being tremendously rude, some of the panels of professional accreditation processes, I think, are possibly stuck in the 1960s and not in the world that we're now in. And I think there's a debate with those professional bodies to say, actually, if this generation of students is going to come into the environment with all of this digital capacity, how do we actually recognize that skill set in a very broad range of professions? And there's an area there that I think is ripe for exploration between university leadership teams and those professional bodies.
There is a question from one of our audience, or one of our participants, that I think I should bring in now. This was a question that was intended for you, and the question was whether you think you'll retain that sort of blended combination of face-to-face and blended learning in the long term, having done what you've done in this out of necessity.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of points there. One is, will every subject have some element which is blended? We already do, because we already have lecture capture and things like that. And also, this is the second bit, will we now design some subjects that sit within the course which are totally digital and just embedded in there? Because if we do that, so hypothetically, if every fourth subject was a digital enabled subject, we might actually be able to reduce some of our cost structure for the long term, and that, given the world we're in, may well be a really helpful thing to do. So that debate is happening with our Deputy Vice-Chancellor Education, of trying to look at the future design of our courses and which elements do we try and keep as 100% digital for the future. The second part of the question, because I can see it there, which was what were the key quality challenges? And the key quality challenge that we had was really mundane. It's the connection between the student's house and the national broadband system here in Australia, yeah, and the quality of the kit that the students had. We've spent possibly $2 million buying additional laptop computers, dongles, bits of software, upgrading students' computers to make sure that when they go Zooming or whatever platform they're on, that they're able to get a full experience. And you won't be surprised, Vivian, that the quality of the IT experience and the kit that students have is very socioeconomically determined. And so, we've actually subsidized some students to make sure they've stayed in the system rather than dropping out of the system.
Yeah, I mean, digital poverty is going to be a huge debate. And if you think about, all of us in the UK are sort of trying to homeschool. You may even see some of my children at some point during this webinar. It is constantly in my mind. We're a family in which every child can have a device, and we're very lucky in that respect. And if you think about the way that the disadvantages experienced by those families who can't do that during this phase of their schooling, and how that will feed through into higher education, I think that is a debate that will come. I'm going to come back to Michael in a moment on the same question about strategy and hindsight. But Libby, is your sense that universities in Australia have been consistently on it? Have they all responded well? Are there lessons you can draw from the variability of institutional responses on the strategic level?
Yeah, how to win friends and influence. Thanks, Sophie. Yes, there has been a variation of responses, of course. I think, what we've seen, you mentioned this idea of organizational agility and decision-making capability, and that has absolutely been at the forefront, right, in this. So, yes, we've seen it done really well in some cases, and in other cases, NOUS has actually come in and supported some institutions in terms of their crisis response and being able to do that. But it's been really interesting, learnt lessons. Yes, overall, of course, the sector, as in the UK, does need to get better and get more simple at decision-making, governance, capability, agility, all of those things. In terms of the work that NOUS has been doing, this kind of goes into the category for us of what you referred to, of really the ability to embed new forms of best practice that have been learnt during this crisis. So we are working with a number of clients and universities across Australia, thinking about that idea of how you ensure that you embed good practice that has occurred during COVID-19, and you don't lose it. But yet around, it is an absolutely critical point around agility and decision making, because those that come out of this well will be those that have learned those lessons and embedded that practice, delivered those culture change, those governance changes, and are able to come out as at their most agile and most capable in terms of that decision making.
Michael, you said something wonderful. I can't remember exactly the phrase you used about how exciting and galvanizing the first phase of the crisis was. Is there any way you can keep that sort of speed and agility, the kind of doing the impossible in that phase, in the way that you work in the future, do you think?
Yeah, so I think there are three things strategically, and one of them does have to do with that. And it has to do with different kinds of leadership for different moments. And there certainly was in the sector and at my place a great sense of sort of esprit de corps and a willingness to push aside the rules and all the rest of it. And that was terrific for a moment at which we had to respond to a crisis. But of course, you can't live in that state forever, because universities are by nature communities of discourse, and they are at their best communities that are just deeply consultative in the kind of way that you can't afford to be in quite the same way in a crisis. And so I think there's something exciting, particularly for people in leadership positions, in moments when you're able to just get things done. But I think it would be quite wrong to think that that would be a good way of running a university. And one of the interesting transitions that the sector, both here and in the UK, is going to face over the next 6 months is, how do you return to leadership as normal? One of the things in leadership that was really good for us in that phase, and that I was kind of proud of, was that we've worked for a decade on really getting rid of the caste system that is so much a part of universities between professional and academic staff, and having genuine parity of esteem in our academic and professional leadership across the university was incredibly important in this context, where you needed to be making decisions about how many times you needed to clean the handles in a room in order to be able to decide whether or not you did teaching of a particular kind there, in a way that was very engaged. And so I think that thing that we've always thought was important has been shown to be more important than ever. I think Paul has touched on the whole issue of online and on-site. And you know, for a university like mine, the universities with the $45 billion endowments, they will do what they've been doing forever, and they'll keep on going on doing it forever. The lots of teaching intensive universities may eventually go online. For a university like mine, the on-campus experience is incredibly important, and how you leverage the social capital of the institution for the benefit of the students in various ways. And this experience has, as Paul suggested, shown that actually it's even more important than we thought, and therefore investment in the student experience, which we've been heavily emphasising over the last little while, we're strategically more committed to. The big question that has emerged for us out of this is how much research the university can afford to do if the government is not going to fund more research, and also if the and if the international student market either dries up or becomes more limited. And what I mean by that is this: at my university, with a very few exceptions, every academic has a post guaranteed under our standard terms and conditions. There's 40% research, 40% teaching, and 20% so-called service. Now, that 40% research time for every academic, and often the 40% of teaching. So, for example, in our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, that's about 3.5 hours a week, or 3 hours a week over a 48-week year. So it's about 6 hours a week in during term. That 40% investment in research is a huge investment of people's time when you're making money, as we are, essentially from student fees. And that's because, of course, we all believe in the teaching and research nexus and all the rest of it. but the assumption has sort of grown in Australia over the last 30 years or so, that means that the teaching research nexus has to be embodied in every individual in a particular kind of way, and that it's possible to think about communities of scholars in a department or a school where some focus more on teaching, some focus more on research, or where research expectations in terms of quantity of some people are lower because they're doing more teaching or whatever. That's been a conversation that it has been impossible to have in Australia, at least in the research intensive universities. And I think if the funding from international students for research in Australia dries up, the question will become not how much great research should we do, because the answer to that is as much as possible. Not how much terrible research should we do, because the answer of that should be none, but how much, yeah, okay, it's quite good, it was sort of worth reading, gives an interesting another idea, another little perspective on that sort of point, should we do. And the Australian emphasis, the Australian system has provided incentives for producing a lot of that work. You know, when I took my job at Sydney, one of the charts they gave me was of the page count of research that the university produced as opposed to the page counts of some other institutions. How much of that can we afford to do? And that's a challenge because it goes deeply to the heart of who we are as an institution and how we merit and how we value our work as academics.
Yeah. Okay. Look, this is a nice bridge.
That's why I'm glad to be going to a place where research is generously funded.
Well, look,
more generously funded.
I'm going to bring us to the international bit, because obviously a lot of our audience is going to be the sort of international folk in universities, and they're all, I think, very, very concerned about the effect of what we're going through on international recruitment. It is going to be the key determinant of the question you've raised, which is how much the cross-subsidy research is affected. You have talked about the move to online. What's your sense of the appetite amongst prospective international students for the type of education you're offering now? We've seen in lots of the surveys that we've been tracking a distinct reluctance to engage in online learning versus face-to-face. Are you able to convince students that what you're offering, the kind of predominantly blended offer, is high quality, is worth making the journey for? Paul, maybe start with you.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a really interesting question. I think we're seeing two sets of behaviours. So the continuing students who got stranded overseas, if I can put it like that, because they've gone home to see parents or for Chinese New Year or whatever reason they travelled away from Australia, those students have stayed predominantly engaged, and there are remarkable statistics showing that those students are still online and doing their subjects. The students who've been more difficult to bring in are the commencing students who are asking the question, why do I need to do that? Why can't I just defer for a year? And so that is split. And I think that's what's causing a lot of vice-chancellors and financial people looking at university budgets concern about what does session 1 2021 look like if we then have to bring students through quarantine in order to start their course. And our federal minister out of Canberra, Minister Tian, is pushing very hard for the reactivation of campus, the point that Michael has made, in order to demonstrate that a substantial portion of courses are now back live rather than just digital, in order then to build the argument in the international community to say coming to Australia, even though there are the additional costs of going through quarantine, is worthwhile because you'll step into a world-class education environment, much of which will have returned to normal as we thought normal was at the end of last year. So a lot of complex steps in all of that.
Which brings me to the question of digital delivery in places where the infrastructure may not be really adapted to carry on. And you've had a presumably a real challenge delivering online education to Chinese students in the first phase of this crisis. What's your experience of making sure that students who aren't on campus, who are learning remotely in places where either connectivity is bad or there are barriers to internet access, what have you done about that?
So for the students who are here, we've intervened at their household level to make sure that they've got technology. So there's been a huge effort by our professional service body that deals with IT management and services in order to get bespoke activities to the level of student and their household. The greater difficulty for those continuers who are offshore, the Chinese infrastructure has been remarkably good, and in fact the ongoing engagement of Chinese students very strong. When I look into the Indian and Nepali data, which are those are the three big communities that are here at Wollongong, you can see less access to technology when you get into Nepal and places like that. So there are quite distinct geographic boundaries around how you can carry on delivering these sorts of continuing experiences before you ask students then to come back in and carry on and complete their course in normal mode here in Australia. I don't know whether Michael's got a similar view, because you've obviously got large populations all over the world.
Yeah, no, so a very similar view. And I mean, the Chinese have been great. So one of the things that was a great relief for us, for example, was when the Chinese government said that online, if you start your course online, it still counts for the purpose of a Chinese qualification, which for a foreign qualification in China, which was hugely important. And in fact, we've done surveying of prospective students, and a lot of our students are saying that they would be prepared to start second semester overseas, even online, which has been somewhat encouraging. And I have to say, we've been flogging the line, well, if you can get a whole semester without having to pay the high cost of living in Sydney or London for that matter, why wouldn't you do it? But it's the question of technology access is much more important in jurisdictions outside China, where it's been relatively easy.
Yeah, okay. We're almost up against time, and there are so many things I would like to ask you about, but I'm going to come back to the question of the reliance on international income to support university operations, and particularly the research system. What's the long-term lesson, or what do you think is going to be the long-term consequence of this for the way that universities have structured their finances and for government? Michael, perhaps to start with you.
So international education is kind of fascinating, and it's fascinating as a political issue. So international education is obviously hugely important. It diversifies your campus, it prepares your domestic students for an international career. 40% of our domestic students don't speak English at home in any case, so it just increases that diversity. For the country, it's amazing soft power in our region. You know, if you go to a University of Sydney alumni event in China, it's like an Australia Day rally. It's all pluses, and yet it is levels of international education are something you have to watch, because if there is a perception that you have too many international students, and in particular concentrated from too many jurisdictions, it impacts your social license to operate. That said, all the predictions are that students, particularly in our region, will be internationally mobile, and if anything, increasingly internationally mobile for the foreseeable future. So it's a great benefit to the country. The tricky thing, I think, is to compare it, the political response in COVID-19 to the tourism industry and to the education industry in Australia.
Yeah. And
the tourism industry, everybody was enormously sympathetic about, because we want people to come and to, you know, take their money for a couple of weeks and then go home. The education industry says, actually, do you want people to come and be deeply a part of your social fabric? How truly multicultural a community is this? How truly are we open to the world? and the answers that have been offered in Australia and many other jurisdictions, including the United States and sometimes even the UK, haven't always been pretty today.
Yeah. Folks, we're out of time. I'm so sorry because there are many, many things I would like to have asked you. I think this is a conversation we'll be able to continue, however. I want to thank Nous for working with us to bring this conversation together, and to thank all three of you with apologies that we haven't been able to delve into many of the issues I would have loved to discuss. We are going to keep watching Australia. We're going to try and learn from your experience of return to campus. And I hope also there'll be opportunities for us to reciprocate and to share what the UK is doing and some of the great things as well as some of the challenges that have come out of this crisis. Thanks to our audience for sticking with us. We've had, I think at the height, about 115 people on this webinar. We'll keep doing things like this as long as it's useful. So thank you so much and enjoy your evening if you're in Australia and the rest of your day if you are in the UK. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Take care.